with all these concessions that are being provided by the lessors, the ISB actually decided to provide a practical expedient, which would provide relief to the lessees from applying lease modification accounting to the COVID-related rent concessions if certain criteria are met. So as we'll talk about later on in the session, if the application of lease modification accounting for lessees can be pretty time-consuming, and it takes a lot of effort. So, which is why the ISB decided to provide this practical expedient. However, no relief was actually provided to the lessors. And the application of the practical expedient is not mandatory. However, if the lessee does decide to apply the practical expedient, the lessee would have to apply the practical expedient consistently to all contracts with similar characteristics and in similar circumstances. So, for example, the lessee may decide to only apply the practical expedient to rent concessions for property leases, but not to their equipment leases. And the amendment to HKFRS 16 will be applied retrospectively with an adjustment with a cumulative effect adjustment being made to the retained earnings at the beginning of the period. And the amendment is effective in 2021 for calendar year-end companies. And earlier adoption is allowed, and in most cases, if companies do apply the practical expedient, they'll probably early adopt so that they can reflect the impacts in this year. And in terms of disclosures, the amendment would require an entity to disclose the population of leases that apply the practical expedient and the P&L impact of applying the practical expedient. As I mentioned earlier, in order to apply the practical expedient, the rent concessions will have to meet certain criteria. First of all, the rent concession has to be a direct consequence of COVID-19. And secondly, the change in lease payments have to be the same or less than the lease payments that the lessee is obligated to pay immediately preceding the change. And the only exception to that is if for example, if the lessor decides to allow the lessee to defer the lease payments, and then with the deferral, the lessee has to pay a slightly higher amount for the lease payment to compensate the lessor for the time value of money. Other than that, overall, in order to apply the practical expedient, the lease payments have to be lower or the same or lower than what they were before the rent concession. Another requirement is that the lessee, the reduction to the rental payments would only affect payments that are originally due on or before June 30, 2021. However, the rent concession can result in a reduction of rental payments before June 30, 2021, with a subsequent increase in rental payments after June 30, 2021. That would still meet the requirements to apply the practical expedient. And lastly, to apply the practical expedient, the rent concession, there cannot be any other substantive changes to the terms and conditions of the lease agreement to apply the practical expedient. So, for example, the lessee and the lessor may not agree to extend the lease or add extension options or termination options, as part of the rent concession, if that's the case, then the lessee would not be able to apply the practical expedient. And in terms of the biggest advantage of applying the practical expedient is that when the lessee remeasure the lease liability, it would remeasure the lease liability using the original incremental borrowing rate instead of a revised discount rate on the date of the modification. So if the rent concession does not meet the requirements to apply the practical expedient, or if the company decides not to apply the practical expedient, then the lessee would follow your normal lease modification accounting for the rent concession and follow the requirements of lease modification accounting under HKFRS 16. If it does apply the practical expedient, the amendment actually did not specify how to account for COVID-related rent concessions, other than referring back to the principles of HKFR 16 in situations where there are changes in lease payments when there isn't a lease modification. Because of that, we believe that there are three possible approaches to accounting for the rent concessions under the practical expedient. The first approach is to account for the rent concession as a negative variable lease payment. And the second approach is to account for the rent concession as fixing your previous variable lease payments. And the third approach is to account for the rent concession as if the lease was unchanged. But the third approach is only applicable for situations where the rent concession is simply a deferral of payments.